If one day, a woman you have never met were to rein in her horse in front of your home, look straight into your eyes and say, "I need you to be the father of my child," not for love, not for money, but because she believes you are the only man who would not hurt her. And the real question would not be why she chose you, but this: would you dare to believe in yourself? When has no one in your entire life ever? Ethan Walker was accustomed to silence, not the gentle silence of a peaceful morning, but a silence that had stretched on for years, the kind that clung to the walls of a house, soaked into the grain of the wood, and settled in a person's chest for so long that they no longer recognized it as loneliness. He lived alone on a small ranch, isolated nearly 40 miles from the nearest town. An old wooden house, a low fence, a few head of cattle, and a pickup truck well past its prime. Every morning, Ethan woke before dawn, not because anyone needed him, but because the work always did, whether there was someone there or not. He fed the horses, checked the stalls, replaced rotting boards, and hauled water up from the well. Everything repeated itself. Everything was familiar. Nothing required him to speak to anyone or look at anyone for too long. That was why he chose this life. No one waited for him. No one was disappointed in him. And that way, he could not hurt anyone. 4 years earlier, Ethan had lived somewhere else. There were neighbors. There was laughter. There was a life people called normal. But things fell apart not in the loud way people imagine. There were no explosive arguments, no dramatic betrayal, just silences that lasted longer. Looks like no longer waiting. Words were swallowed because saying them wouldn't change anything anyway. In the end, Ethan left, not out of hatred, but because he believed his absence would make things easier for everyone. He never thought of it as cowardice. He called it the safer choice. On this ranch, no one asked why he never married. No one wondered why a 40-year-old man chose to live as quietly as a shadow. Here, there was only land, wind, and work. Ethan once believed that was enough. But on some evenings, when the wind moved through the grasslands and the wooden house made faint sounds, noises like quiet sighs, he would sit in the darkness, staring into the space before him and wonder, if one day I disappeared completely, would anyone notice? He never looked for the answer. He had learned how not to ask questions that could hurt him. That morning began exactly like any other. Clear sky, soft sunlight, the familiar scent of dry grass. Ethan carried his old hammer and walked along the eastern fence line to replace a rotted post. He worked slowly, carefully, as if everything in the world could be fixed if one were patient long enough. Then he felt that something was wrong. Not a sound, not a strange smell, but the sensation of being seen. Ethan lifted his head. About 50 meters away, at the edge of the ranch boundary, a woman sat astride a horse. She was so still that the horse lowered its head to graze, as if they had been there for quite some time. Ethan's heart stalled. He was not used to people standing on his land without warning. But more than that, the way she looked at him. Her gaze did not drift across the scenery or survey the land. It rested directly on him. Ethan froze, one hand on the fence post, the other gripping the hammer that suddenly felt awkward in his grasp. His mind went blank, leaving only one clear thought. I don't know how to act. She did not resemble anyone he had ever seen in town. Not a tourist, not someone lost. The way she sat on the horse showed a natural confidence, not showy, not guarded, as if this place did not intimidate her at all. Ethan lowered his head and pretended to work, a familiar reflex. He always did this when he did not know how to face people, stay busy, hope they would leave on their own. But when he glanced up again, She was closer. 20 meters. 15. Each step of the horse was slow and deliberate. Ethan felt his throat go dry. Part of him wanted to turn and walk away. Another part could not move at all, as if something were holding him there. Not courage, but confusion. She stopped only a few steps from him, close enough that Ethan could clearly see the details of her face. Eyes sharp but not cold. Features strong but not harsh. The face of someone accustomed to making decisions and taking responsibility for them. She studied him for a long moment, unhurried, not probing, as though confirming something in her own mind. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, without hesitation, the voice of someone who had thought about these words for a very long time. I need a man I can trust to be the father of my child. The hammer slipped from Ethan's hand, hitting the ground with a dull, final sound. He opened his mouth, but no words came. In that instant, everything he believed about the world, about himself, began to fracture. Because nothing in Ethan Walker's life had ever prepared him for this moment. And deep within the confusion, a frightening truth slowly surfaced. Perhaps the quiet life he had protected for the past 4 years had just come to an end. Ethan stood motionless for a long time after her words fell into the stillness of the open field. The wind continued to blow. The horse continued to graze. The world around them did not change at all. Only Ethan felt as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The woman in front of him did not repeat herself. She did not appear impatient either. She sat upright on the horse, her hands resting loosely, her gaze still fixed on Ethan, not pressing, not provoking, just waiting. As if, whatever his reaction might be, she had already accounted for it. Ethan bent down to pick up the hammer, his hand trembling slightly. He forced a smile, an awkward one, the kind he always used when he did not know what to say. You've got the wrong person, he said, his voice rougher than he expected. I'm not who you think I am. She tilted her head, studying him. No, she said, I'm not mistaken. The way she said it unsettled Ethan, not because of arrogance, but because of certainty. A certainty that left him nowhere to hide. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his distance. I live alone. I don't know you. You don't know anything about me. On the contrary, she replied softly. I know quite a lot. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The woman finally dismounted. Her movements were clean and assured, as though her body was accustomed to moving through wide, open spaces like this. When they stood at eye level, Ethan realized she was slightly taller than he was. Not by much, but enough that he had to look up, a sensation he was not used to. My name is Maya, she said. Maya Red Cloud. He nodded, committing the unfamiliar name to memory, then fell silent again. Maya did not rush to fill the gap. You've lived here for 3.5 years, she continued evenly. You don't go into town unless you absolutely have to. You don't let anyone onto your land, but you've never driven anyone away harshly. You fix broken fences instead of cursing. You talk to your horses in a low voice, as if you're afraid of startling them. Ethan felt his heart begin to race. You carry water to the northern edge of your land whenever there's a drought, Maya went on, for the wild horses, even though they don't belong to you. He looked at her, unable to hide his confusion. You've been watching me? Observing, she corrected. For 5 days. 5 days. The number hung heavily between them. Ethan did not know whether he should feel violated or noticed. The latter frightened him more. Why? He asked. The question escaped before he could stop himself. Maya was silent for a moment. Something softer, more fragile, flickered in her eyes, very briefly, but long enough for Ethan to notice. Because I don't have many choices, she said, and I don't myself to choose wrong. She took a small step toward him. Instinctively, Ethan stepped back until his shoulders touched the fence post behind him. Maya stopped immediately, recognizing his reaction. She did not move closer, only stood there, keeping just enough distance. "I didn't come here to force you," she said, her voice lowered. "You have every right to refuse. But I need you to understand why I chose you before you say no." Ethan swallowed hard. He nodded, though his thoughts were still in turmoil. "In my tribe," Maya continued, "people always talk about strength. Who is stronger, who fights better, who makes others afraid. They call that a man." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the field before returning to him. "But I've seen what men like that do when no one is watching." Ethan did not ask. He feared the answer. "My mother was once married to a man like that," Maya said. Her voice remained calm, but her hands tightened slightly. "He never hit her, never shouted. He just made her disappear, little by little. When she died, people said it was an illness. I knew better. She simply ran out of reasons to keep living." The air seemed to sink under the weight of her words. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, a familiar sensation, the feeling of someone long accustomed to believing they were not significant enough to be held on to. "I don't want my child to grow up in fear," Maya said, "and I don't want them to learn that strength means making others bow." She looked straight at Ethan. "I see in you what those men don't have," she said slowly. "You're afraid. But you don't unload that fear onto the world. You work. You wait. You respect what you cannot control." Ethan let out a quiet, sad laugh. "You're confusing fear with weakness." Maya shook her head. "No, I know the difference." She stepped forward half a pace, raising her hand, but stopping midair, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. When Ethan did not move, she lightly touched his arm, just her fingertips, barely there. "You think you're weak because you don't hurt people," she said. "But to me, that's what makes you safe." For a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. Maya withdrew her hand and stepped back. "I'll come back," she said. "Tomorrow. Think about what I've said. Not about me, about yourself." Then she turned, mounted her horse, and left the way she had come, quietly, deliberately, without looking back. Ethan stood there for a long time, until her figure was nothing more than a small dot on the horizon. Only then did he realize something that frightened him more than everything that had just happened. A deep part of him was hoping she would return. Ethan did not sleep that night. Not from fear in the familiar sense, but from something else, a feeling of being awakened. As if someone had knocked hard on a door inside him, a door he had locked long ago, then walked away without waiting for an answer. He sat at the old wooden table by the window, staring out into the thick darkness of the field. His reflection in the glass was faint, unfamiliar. The man in that pane looked tired, older than his years, yet also different. Something was waiting in his eyes, not hope, but the possibility of hope. "She's mistaken," Ethan told himself. "She has to be." He had already prepared his refusal, polite, brief, causing no harm. He knew how to retreat without making a sound. It was a skill he had practiced his entire life. Morning came, and Ethan did everything as usual. Fed the horses, checked the stalls, drew water from the well. The familiar motions anchored him to reality, as if by keeping the world unchanged, yesterday would erase itself. But when he looked toward the east, where the horizon opened into a long stretch of grass, his hand froze on the bucket handle. Maya was there. The exact spot as the day before. The same upright posture on horseback, the same patience that made Ethan feel small. He set the bucket down, wiped his hands on his pants, and started walking before he could think any further. Each step felt heavy, not because of the distance, but because of the unanswered questions piling up in his mind. Maya did not dismount when he approached. She waited for him to speak first. "I don't know your name," Ethan said, his voice low and dry. "Maya," she replied. "And you?" "Ethan." Hearing his own name leave his lips felt strange, as if no one had spoken it in a very long time. "Why me?" he asked. The question came out rough, unpolished, nothing like the careful words he had rehearsed in his head. But it was the real question, the one that had kept him awake all day, night. Maya looked at him for a long moment, not with judgment, but with the gaze of someone weighing a brutal truth. Then she dismounted. Her movement was slower than the day before, intentional. When she stood in front of him, she kept just enough distance, not touching, not crowding. Ethan noticed and felt grateful. "I observed you for 5 days," Maya said. "Not to find your strengths, but to see what you do when no one is watching." She spoke of small things, the way he stroked a horse's neck when it was frightened, the way he stopped in the middle of his work to fix a crooked board even when no one would see, the way he waited, without forcing, when the land did not yield results right away. "Other men," she said, "they demand, they pressure, they call it leadership." Ethan remained silent. He had known men like that, in the city, in town, everywhere. "You're different," Maya said. "You ask, you wait, you respect." Ethan shook his head. "That's only because I'm not strong enough to do otherwise." Maya did not argue immediately. She studied him, her gaze earnest. "What do you think strength is?" Ethan had no answer, because every definition he had ever held failed to fit himself. Before he could say anything more, the sound of hooves echoed from a distance. 3 riders appeared on the ridge behind Maya, not fast, not hurried, yet an invisible pressure radiated from the way they approached, the pressure of judgment. Maya stiffened. Ethan sensed it even before she spoke. For the first time, he saw fear clearly on her face, not fear for herself, but fear of what was coming closer. They stopped a short distance away. 2 men and an older woman. Their eyes passed over Ethan as if he were an insignificant detail, then settled on Maya. They spoke in a language he did not understand, but he understood the tone. Reproach, disappointment, objection. Maya responded calmly but firmly. Each of her sentences tightened the air like another drawn wire. The older woman pointed toward Ethan. The look she gave him was not angry, but contemptuous, the kind reserved for something not worth concern. Ethan felt his face grow hot, not from anger, but from shame. The familiar feeling rose, whispering that he was standing where he did not belong, that his presence only made things worse. Then Maya stepped in front of him, not much, just half a step, but enough to place her body between him and that gaze. She turned to them and spoke in English, her voice clear, decisive. "This is my choice." The older woman gave a thin smile. "You choose weakness." The air froze. Ethan wanted to disappear, wanted to say they were right, wanted to apologize for existing in this space. But Maya did not retreat. "You call it weakness," she said slowly, "because you only know how to measure strength by noise. I measure it by what remains when no one is watching." She turned back to Ethan for just a second, but in that look was something that tightened his chest. She was betting on him. And for the first time in his life, Ethan understood the actual cost of being chosen. Not glory, but responsibility. Maya left after that confrontation without saying anything more. promised, no reminder of her proposal. She left only a heavy emptiness between Ethan and the vast field where every thought had enough space to echo. Ethan stood there for a long time until the sound of hooves had disappeared entirely beyond the ridge. The feeling of being judged lingered in his chest like a cold stone, not because the words had been fierce, but because they were painfully familiar. He had heard them in many forms throughout his life. Not strong enough, not decisive enough, not someone others could rely on. He returned to his wooden house as the afternoon faded. Clouds were rolling in from the west, thick and low. The wind shifted, carrying a heavy scent of moisture. Ethan looked up at the roof, the darkened boards, warped in places by years of rain and sun. He knew it needed repairs. He had known for a long time. It just had never felt urgent enough. Night fell faster than usual. Wind whistled through the cracks. Rain began to fall, first sparse, then heavier. Ethan sat in the small kitchen, listening to each drop striking the roof, every sound a reminder. There were things he could not keep postponing. He lay down on the bed, but sleep did not come. Maya's words returned, repeating themselves. Not about me. About yourself. He turned over, then sat up suddenly. In his mind, two images overlapped, a man lowering his head before judgment, and a man climbing onto a roof in the middle of a storm. The next morning, Ethan woke to dull gray light. The clouds hung so low they seemed within reach. The wind was stronger. The storm had not arrived yet, but it was waiting. He stepped onto the porch, looked at the sky, then back at the roof. His heart quickened. The familiar fear rose, fear of heights, fear of slipping, fear of making things worse. The sound of hooves came from a distance. Ethan turned. Maya was approaching. This time she did not stop at the fence. She rode straight into the yard and dismounted in front of the porch as if the place were not unfamiliar at all. Her gaze swept over the sky, then settled on the roof. "This storm won't be mild," she said. "Your roof won't hold." Ethan opened his mouth to object, then stopped. He knew she was right. "I'll manage," he said, his voice uncertain. Maya did not argue. She walked straight to the shed, pulled out the old wooden ladder, and leaned it against the side of the house. Her movements were decisive, not forceful. Then she stood there, looking at him, waiting. Not giving orders, not stepping in to do it for him, just waiting to see what he would do. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Pride, fear, embarrassment, all tangled together. He looked at the ladder, then at the darkening sky. If he did nothing, no one would blame him. But he would know, and Maya would know. He picked up the spare wooden boards and walked to the ladder. His palms were slick with sweat as he placed his foot on the first rung. The wind made the ladder tremble slightly. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Slowly," Maya said from below. Not loud, not urging. Ethan climbed. Each rung was a negotiation with fear. From above, the world looked different, broader, but also more fragile. He could see the rotted boards more clearly, the loose, rusted nails. The job was not small, and time was not on his side. The rain began to fall harder. The wind gusted, throwing him off balance. For a moment, he nearly lost his footing. His whole body stiffened. Fear surged, urging him to climb down, to quit, to say this was enough. A hand gripped the ladder firmly from below. Maya said nothing, but her presence was steady, like an anchor. Ethan took a deep breath, held on, and continued. He worked without elegance, without speed, but he did not stop. Each board he replaced was a decision to stay. As the first heavy drops of the downpour came crashing down, he drove in the final nail. He climbed down in the wind, his legs shaking, nearly slipping on the last rung. Maya reached out and steadied his arm. Just a touch, enough to keep him upright. They ran inside as the rain poured like a waterfall. Thunder roared, lightning tore through the sky. Water pounded violently on the roof. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, gasping for breath, his whole body trembling, not from cold, but from adrenaline and a new sensation rising within him. The roof did not leak. The water did not come in. The house remained dry in the middle of the storm. Ethan looked around, then up at the ceiling. A laugh escaped him, short and unexpected, not from joy, but from relief. He had done it. Not perfectly, but enough. Maya stood beside him, her hair and clothes soaked. She looked at him for a long time. The look was not loud praise, just a quiet acknowledgement. "You were afraid," she said. Ethan nodded. He did not deny it. "But you climbed up anyway," Maya continued. "That's what I needed to see." She placed her hand on his chest, right where his heart was still pounding. Ethan did not pull away. This time, he stayed still, letting the sensation remain. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something had changed. No one called it a test, but they both knew. This was the first time Ethan chose not to turn his back when he was afraid. The storm lasted until dawn. When the final sound of rain faded, the wooden house sank into a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, where every sound feels sharper. Ethan sat with his back against the wall, both hands wrapped around a cup of warm water, watching the small flame in the fireplace dance. Maya sat across from him, cross-legged on the wooden floor, silently braiding and unbraiding her hair, an unconscious habit, as if she too were trying to sort through her thoughts. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. There are moments when words only dilute what is happening. Maya broke the silence just as morning light began to appear. "I have 6 days," she said softly, "until the full moon." Ethan looked up. 6 days for what? "For a final decision," she replied. "If I don't choose you, I will have to take another path." Ethan didn't ask what that path was. He understood, and that understanding weighed heavily on his chest. 6 days sounded like a long time, but for choices that reshape an entire life, 6 days were terrifyingly short. Maya stood, pulled on her coat, and stepped outside. Before mounting her horse, she turned back to look at him, a gaze holding everything at once: hope, fear, and an honesty that did not hide itself. "Whatever you choose," she said, "I need you to choose for yourself." She left, and Ethan remained with the longest days of his life. 3 days passed in a state of half-wakefulness. Ethan worked more than usual, as if labor could drown out the noise in his head. But whenever he stopped, images of Maya standing by the fence, beneath the ladder, before the council, returned. Not as an invitation, but as a mirror, forcing him to look directly at himself. On the 4th day, when the morning mist had yet to lift, Ethan heard the pounding of hooves. Not one horse, several. He stepped onto the porch and saw them in the distance, 4 riders crossing the still wet grassland, upright in the saddle, moving fast. Leading them was a tall man with broad shoulders and a sharp, cold gaze. In that instant, Ethan knew. This was the man the world called strong. Maya appeared beside him. He didn't know when she had arrived, but when she stood there gripping his hand tightly, he felt tension spread through his skin. "Lucas Redbear," she said quietly. "The one they chose for me." They stopped about 15 steps from the porch. Lucas dismounted in a clean, efficient motion, as if the land itself belonged to him. He spoke in their language, his voice low and rapid. The others smirked. Maya replied calmly but firmly. The air grew thick. Lucas looked Ethan up and down, his gaze settling on Ethan's calloused hands, hands of a worker, not a fighter. A mocking smile appeared. "You think you can have her?" Lucas switched to English, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You think your silence is strength?" Ethan felt his face burn. The words struck an old wound. He had heard variations of that question his entire life, and his familiar instinct was to retreat. But today, his hand was in Maya's. "She has the right to choose," Ethan said. His voice trembled, but it did not break. Lucas laughed. "She's choosing weakness." He stepped closer, too close. The smell of sweat and leather mixed in the air. The threat was physical, unmistakable, needing no words. Ethan felt his heartbeat slam against his ribs, each beat urging him to run. Lucas grabbed Ethan's shirt and yanked him forward. Maya moved to step in, but Lucas raised a hand to stop her. Between him. Lucas's fist rose slowly, deliberately. A crude, ancient test. Ethan saw the path of the punch clearly, saw the exact moment when, if he tilted his head, everything would be over. He did not move, not because he believed himself invulnerable, but because he understood that what was being measured here was not bone or teeth, but will. If he stepped back, he would confirm everything they believed about him. And worse, he would confirm it to himself. The fist stopped inches from his face. Lucas's hand trembled slightly, holding back its force. 1 second. 2. Time stretched like a taut wire. Then Lucas released him, shoving Ethan back a step. Lucas's expression changed, not to respect, but to recognition. He spoke quickly to Maya, his voice lowered. She tightened her grip on Ethan's hand. Lucas turned away and mounted his horse. The others followed, their faces uncertain. The grassland returned to silence. Ethan stood there, his knees weak. Only when the door closed behind them did he realize he was shaking. Maya knelt in front of him, both hands on his knees, searching his eyes. "You didn't dodge," she said, her voice breaking. "I was afraid," Ethan replied. "That's why," Maya whispered. "You chose to stand." She pulled him into her arms. Ethan rested his forehead against her shoulder, breathing out in heavy breaths. Outside, the sun rose slowly, warming the damp field. Something had left him, not fear itself, but fear's power over him. He lifted his head and looked at Maya. "No matter what happens," he said, "I won't disappear." Maya closed her eyes for a moment, as if she had been waiting for those words for a very long time. And in the quiet after the confrontation, they understood. Violence had lost to a steady presence, not loud, not boastful, but undeniable. After Lucas and those with him left, the world seemed to slow down. Not because everything was over, but because a threshold had just been crossed, and beyond that threshold, there was no returning to how things had been before. Ethan and Maya stood on the porch for a long time. No one spoke. A gentle breeze moved through the dew-damp grassland, carrying the scent of fresh earth. Ethan felt the warmth of Maya's hand still tightly holding his, as if she feared that if she let go, this moment would dissolve. 2 days left, Maya said softly, finally breaking the silence. 2 days until the full moon. Ethan nodded. This time, the number did not panic him as it had before. It was still heavy, still frightening, but no longer vague. He had faced a man willing to use his fists to define strength, and he had held his ground. It did not turn him into a different person, but it confirmed something he had never dared to believe. He could stay when it mattered. The 2 days passed, slowly, but without heaviness. Maya stayed at the ranch, not as a guest, but as someone already familiar with its rhythm. She helped Ethan straighten fences knocked askew by the wind, carried water for the horses, and cooked simple meals. They did not talk much about the future. There was no need to sketch out visions. What needed to be said already lived in their glances, in the way they moved around each other, careful but not distant. On the night before the full moon, they sat by the fireplace. The flames cast warm light against the wooden walls, creating long, unhurried shadows. Maya stared into the fire for a long time, then spoke. "If you say no, I won't blame you." Ethan turned toward her. "But you'll have to leave." Maya nodded. "And I'll have to accept the man they chose. A life that is safe, recognized, but not mine." She didn't say it to put pressure on. It was simply the truth, laid bare. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, not from responsibility, but from clarity. For the first time in his life, he did not have to guess where his choice would lead. The path ahead was painfully clear. "I'm afraid," Ethan said. "Afraid of disappointing you. Afraid that someday you'll realize I'm not the man you need." Maya turned to him, her eyes softer than he had ever seen. "I'm afraid too," she said. "Afraid that I'm seeing what I want to see. Afraid that this hope will hurt me again." She placed a hand on her chest. "But I've lived too long with other people's fears. If I have to be afraid, I want to be afraid of a choice that's mine." Her words were not grand, not dramatic, but they reached Ethan most deeply. He understood then that what Maya needed was not a man who never fell. She needed a man who stayed when he said he would. When the full moon rose high, silver light flooding through the window, Ethan stood up. He didn't speak right away. He stepped closer, stood in front of Maya, and took a deep breath. "I don't need 2 more days," he said. His voice was so calm it surprised even him. "I needed to know whether I could stand beside you when things become difficult. And today, I know." Maya looked at him, searching for hesitation, for an unnamed fear, but she found only sincerity. Not perfect, but steady. "I choose to stay," Ethan said. "Not because I'm certain, but because I don't want to return to a life where I'm always running away." Maya closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, tears shimmered but did not fall. She stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart, feeling its familiar rhythm, a rhythm that had trembled, that had faced a raised fist and had still endured. "Then we don't wait anymore," she said, her voice rough. "Once I choose, I want to walk the whole path." That moment required no vows, no grand promises, just 2 people standing before each other, understanding that this choice would change them forever, and stepping forward anyway. Outside, the breeze stirred the grass. The full moon illuminated the small ranch that had once been a refuge for a man afraid of the world. Now it became the starting point of something else, uncertain, but true. Ethan realized that destiny was not something that fell from the sky. It was built from tiny moments, a step not taken backwards, a hand not let go, and an answer brave enough to say, "Stay," when every part of you wants to run. And under that moonlight, their choice was no longer just a decision. It had become fate. 6 weeks had passed since that night of the full moon. It wasn't a long time, but it was enough for everything in Ethan's life to change in ways he had never imagined. The ranch was still the same, wooden fences, wide-stretching grasslands, the sound of wind in the late afternoons. But inside him, something was different. It was no longer the silence of avoidance, but the quiet of a man who knew where where he stood. Maya stood beside him that morning as the sun rose above the horizon. She rested one hand on her stomach by instinct, a small gesture, almost unconscious. Ethan noticed the change before she said a word. Some things did not need confirmation. They revealed themselves through a look, through the way someone listened to their own body. "I'm sure," Maya said softly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. "We've known for 2 weeks." Ethan didn't shout with joy. He didn't pull her into his arms the way people do in stories. He simply stood there, placing his hand gently over hers, feeling the familiar warmth, a sensation both fragile and strangely solid. A life was beginning, and with it, a responsibility that could not be set aside. That same morning, Ethan noticed a familiar figure on the eastern ridge, the older woman from the tribal council, the one who had once looked at him with contempt, was approaching. There was no entourage, no display of authority, just her alone, riding slowly, as if every step forward had been carefully weighed. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The old reflex to turn away stirred, but this time he did not step back. Maya stood beside him, her hand still on her belly, her expression calm. The woman stopped at a respectful distance. She dismounted, stood upright, and studied them both for a long time. Her gaze was no longer sharp. It was tired and honest. "The council has debated for many days," she said slowly in clear English. "Some said your choice was rebellion. Others said it was foolish." Ethan remained silent. He knew that at this moment any defense would be unnecessary. "Takakota objected," she continued. "His father demanded that we force Maya to comply with the arrangement." Maya stiffened slightly but said nothing. Ethan sensed the tension and gently squeezed her hand, a small gesture, but enough to remind them both that they no longer stood alone. "But it was Takakota himself," the woman went on, "who spoke up to defend this choice." The air seemed to sink. "He said he saw in this man," she nodded toward Ethan, "a kind of strength he does not possess. Not the strength he wants, but the strength that is needed." Ethan looked up, unable to hide his surprise. "He said that forcing a woman to live with a man she does not respect," the woman continued, her voice lowering, "would only repeat old tragedies, tragedies that have taken the spirit from too many women in our tribe." She fell silent for a moment, then exhaled as if releasing a burden she had carried for years. "The council has decided to recognize the child," she said. "The child will belong to the tribe, but there is a condition." Maya spoke, her voice steady. "What condition?" "The child must be raised with our language, our stories, and our traditions," the woman replied. Then she turned to Ethan. "And you must learn them." Without a moment's hesitation, Ethan nodded. "I will learn," he said, "everything that is necessary." The woman looked at him for a long time, this time not to measure him, but to truly see him. At last, she nodded slightly. "My sister once said the same thing," she said, her voice softening, "when she married a man from outside the tribe. She learned their language. They learned ours. She built bridges instead of walls." From a pouch at her side, she took out an old beaded bracelet, its colors faded by time. She handed it to Maya. "It belonged to your grandmother," he said. "She believed courage is never loud." Maya received the bracelet with both hands, tears spilling freely. The woman placed a hand on her shoulder for a brief moment, just long enough to pass on something that needed no words. Then she turned to Ethan. "Protect her spirit," she said quietly. "Not just her body." Ethan nodded. "I will." As the woman mounted her horse and rode away, Maya leaned into him, her tears soaking his shirt. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, feeling the familiar weight, no longer a burden, but a sense of belonging. "We did it," Maya whispered. Ethan shook his head gently. "No," he said. "We're doing it." He looked out across the field ahead, where the wind still moved, where storms would surely come again. But this time, he was not afraid. He now understood that not everyone accepts courage. Courage was staying long enough for your truth to be seen. That afternoon, after the older woman disappeared beyond the ridge, the ranch returned to its familiar quiet. But it was no longer the kind of silence that made Ethan feel small and unnecessary. It was the stillness of a place that had accepted him, the way earth accepts a seed after the rain has passed. Maya sat on the front steps of the porch, her grandmother's beaded bracelet resting neatly in her palm. The late sunlight caught the old beads, drawing out their warm, muted colors. She turned the bracelet slowly, as if tracing the memories of the women who had come before her, women who had chosen in silence, who had endured without ever being named. Ethan stood behind her, leaning against a wooden post, watching. He realized he had grown used to seeing Maya in this space, no longer feeling like she was a stranger stepping into his world. She was here, naturally, as if the ranch had always had room for her, and he had simply never dared to imagine that picture. "Doesn't it feel strange?" Maya said without turning around. "What does?" he asked. "That everything started just because I said one sentence. And you didn't run." Ethan smiled faintly. "I wanted to," he admitted. "It's just that this time, I was tired of running." Maya turned to look at him. There was something softer in her eyes now, no longer the tension of someone fighting to be heard, but the ease of someone who had been allowed to stay with herself. The days that followed passed quietly yet meaningfully. Each evening, Ethan began learning Maya's tribal language. At first, the unfamiliar sounds made him stumble, mispronouncing words, forgetting them almost as soon as he learned them. But Maya didn't correct him right away. She let him speak, let him grow accustomed to not needing to be right immediately. Sometimes he would stop and sigh. "I'm afraid I'll never learn fast enough." Maya smiled. "No one learns to prove anything," she said. "We learn in order to stay." Those words stayed with Ethan for days. He began to notice changes in himself through tiny things. He no longer avoided people's eyes when he went into town to buy supplies. He greeted the shopkeeper and spoke more than a single polite phrase. He realized he no longer felt the need to shrink himself just to exist. One afternoon, as they were repairing the northern fence, Ethan suddenly stopped working. He looked out across the field where the wild horses often appeared. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that if I lived quietly enough, the world would forget about me." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder. "And now? Now I understand. I don't need to disappear to be safe." The words were not loud, but for Ethan, they were a declaration. That night they lay beside each other in the small room, moonlight filtering through the window and spilling across the ceiling. Maya guided Ethan's hand to her belly, where life was forming, still. Very small, but undeniably real. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling his own heartbeat settle into the moment. "Are you afraid?" Maya asked softly. "Yes," Ethan answered. "But it's a different kind of fear. Not fear of losing, but fear of not being worthy." Maya turned toward him, looking straight into his eyes. "No one is worthy of something this big," she said. "All anyone can do is choose to take responsibility for it." Ethan thought of the man he used to be, the man who had lived for 3 years in a wide-open field and still felt cramped inside his own body. He thought of the day Maya appeared, of the fist that stopped inches from his face, of the roof that held through the storm. He realized that change does not arrive in a single radiant moment. It comes little by little, through choices no one applauds. Choices like unstepping back when being looked down on, unstill running back when they still completely. All unpossibly running. No way that shoes created together but among friends and fraude. Choices like no necessary to released process. Ethan Showback as welling the man per the man had ticks to the moment. Choices like plain for me and morm and so construction with no one still given it. Choices like running back when being looked down on. Ethan stay how to feel this connected me of choices that change did not arrive in a single radiant moment. Choices like treating, change to it, in the big blow. Choices like change to be way and more feeling so forth. Ethan Showback is no one by little. Choices like plain for me and morm and so. Choices like change to be, no one still down on. Ethan watching him that it's plain for me and morm and so. Choices like people through the joy. Ethan Showback is no one by little. Choices like carify that's still running. Ethan Showback is no one by little. The choices like change to be and no one likely morm and so. Ethan Showback is no one by little. Ethan for me, the choices like people through the joy. Ethan Showback is no one by little. Choices like carify that's still running. Ethan Showback is no one by little. Choices like carify that's still running. Are you afraid? Maya asked, down on. Fronting when being truly reflect. Ethan Showback, no one by little. Choices like people through the joy. Ethan Showback is down on responsibility when afraid. Refusing when being truly seen. On another, Ethan woke before Maya. He stepped onto the porch and took a deep breath of the fresh air. Dawn spread across the grassland, bathing everything in pale gold. He stood there alone, but no longer lonely. He finally understood something he had never understood for many years. Some people are not born to be loud or to dominate. They are born to stay, to hold steady, to support things more fragile than themselves, quietly. Maya stepped out behind him and rested her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "I'm thinking this might be the first time I've ever truly lived." Maya squeezed his hand gently. No more words were needed. In that moment, Ethan Walker understood that the unborn child was not the only thing being brought into the world. He, too, had just been born a second time. Not into someone else, but into the version of himself he had never allowed to exist. And this time, he had no intention of disappearing again. Time moved quietly after that, the way lasting things often do. There were no grand ceremonies, no moments marked by applause, only days following one another, each carrying a small task to be done and a reason to stay. Ethan gradually grew used to waking while Maya still slept. He lit the stove, brewed coffee, opened the door and looked out over the fields changing color with the season. Some mornings fog hung low, blurring everything. On others, the sky was clear, sunlight stretching to the horizon. Whatever the day, he no longer felt the need to check where he was hiding in the world. He was exactly where he belonged. Maya began telling him the stories of her tribe, not as lessons, but as shared memory. Stories of women who knew how to listen to the land, of men who understood that strength was not about taking, but about holding. Ethan listened slowly, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just nodding. He didn't try to understand quickly. He learned how to understand deeply. Some evenings, he mispronounced a vital word, twisting the meaning of the story completely. Ethan blushed and apologized. Maya laughed, a soft, rare laugh, but a real one. "It's all right," she said. "Language is like people. It allows us to be wrong, as long as we don't give up." In moments like that, Ethan realized the future was no longer a vague shape hanging before him. It had taken form, not sharply defined, but close enough to touch. One late afternoon, as they were fixing the barn door, Ethan suddenly stopped. He looked at his hands, old calluses, new scrapes. Those hands had once been enough only to keep himself alive. Now, they were preparing for a life with another breath in it. "How do you think I'll be as a father?" he asked, not looking at Maya. The question fell between two hammer strikes, simple, yet heavy. Maya set her tools down and stood beside him. "No one becomes a father by already knowing the answers," she said. "There are only those who stay when they're needed." Ethan nodded. He understood. Staying. That was what had changed everything. One day, Ethan had to go into town to buy supplies. The shopkeeper asked about the woman who had been coming with him lately. Ethan answered slowly, without evasion. He didn't boast, and he didn't hide. For the first time, he spoke about his life without fearing how others might define him. On the way back, he realized something small but significant. He was no longer carrying his defenses. If someone didn't understand, he no longer felt the need to shrink himself to explain. He knew what he was building, and that was enough. In the evenings, Maya often placed a hand on her belly and spoke very softly, as if the child could hear. Ethan sat beside her in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some things were meant to be held in quiet. He learned to trust that his presence, simply being there, was itself a form of love. At times, the old fear returned. On windy nights, Ethan would wake with his heart racing, images of storms, fists, and judging eyes flooding back. He lay still, breathing. Maya would turn slightly in her sleep and take his hand. Just that, and the fear would retreat. Ethan understood that courage was not the permanent absence of fear. Courage was learning to live with it without letting it lead. One morning, they stood together on the porch. Maya leaned against him, sunlight on her face, peaceful to the point of almost feeling unreal. Ethan looked out toward the dirt road stretching to the horizon. That road had once been an escape. Now it was simply part of the landscape, no longer an invitation to disappear. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Maya asked gently. Ethan thought for a moment. "I regret living so long without allowing myself to be seen," he said. "But I don't regret being here." Maya smiled. She didn't need grand promises. The certainty was in the way he spoke, quiet, unshowy. As the sun rose higher, they went back inside. Work was waiting. Small tasks, steady and patient. Ethan felt a new rhythm of life taking shape, not the rhythm of escape, but of commitment. He knew the future would bring difficult days. There would be disagreements, fatigue, moments of doubt. But unlike before, he no longer saw those things as signs to leave. They were simply part of the path he had chosen to step onto and was ready to keep walking. In that morning light, Ethan Walker did not see himself as a man who had been granted a future. He saw himself as a man who had dared to accept it. And for the first time, the future, with all its unknowns, no longer frightened him. It was something he was ready to welcome. That afternoon, sunlight settled slowly on the wooden roof, bathing everything in a gentle golden hue. A light breeze moved through the grassland, carrying the scent of earth and dry hay, the smell of seasons past and seasons yet to come. Ethan stood on the porch, looking toward the horizon. The dirt road that had once been an escape route was now only a thin line in the vast landscape, no longer calling him away. Maya stepped out beside him and rested her hand on her belly, a tiny gesture, yet complete. Ethan placed his hand there as well, feeling the life forming beneath his palm, fragile, steadfast, and so honest it made his chest tighten. He made no promises. There was no need. Some things only need to be present to be proven. They had walked a path no one applauded. No ceremonies, no fireworks, only quiet choices. Fixing a roof when the wind rose, standing still when a fist stopped inches from the face, learning a new language with the patience of someone beginning again. Those choices did not make them extraordinary, but they made them real. Ethan thought of the man he once was, living amid open space, yet cramped within himself. He had believed silence was safety, that disappearing was kindness. But now he understood something painfully simple. Safety does not come from hiding, but from having someone to stay with. And courage is not loud, not about defeating others. Courage is not abandoning yourself when you are afraid. Maya rested her head against his shoulder. She had fought in her own way, not with violence, but with choice. She chose not to repeat the paths that had wounded the women before her. She chose a man willing to learn, willing to listen, willing to stay when things became difficult. And in that choice, she did not only protect the child's future, she protected her own spirit. As dusk fell, the sky slowly shifted colors. Ethan realized that the future did not need to be clear to be trustworthy. It only needed to be built from real. Days where you wake up knowing you are in the right place with the right person for the right reason. "Are you afraid?" Maya asked softly. Ethan thought for a moment. "Yes," he answered, "but I'm not afraid alone anymore." She smiled, a smile that needed to prove nothing. It only needed to exist. Night came and the light from inside the house spilt onto the porch, warm and steady. Out there, the world continued. Wind still blew, seasons still changed, storms would surely come again. But Ethan knew roofs could be repaired, fences could be rebuilt, and the human heart, if chosen well, could become a shelter. Some stories do not end with a period. They end with a steady breath, a hand held tight, and a decision repeated every day. This story is one of those. It does not claim that everything will be easy. It only whispers that ease is not what makes something right. Before going inside, Ethan looked once more at the grassland. He was no longer a man afraid of being seen. He had learned to stand upright in the gaze of others, not to earn praise, but to stop bowing to his own fear. Maya took his hand. They stepped across the threshold together. And somewhere, very close, a future was waiting, not as a gift, but as a responsibility held with love. Courage does not erase fear. It only teaches us how not to let fear decide for us. Some people are not born to conquer the world. They are born to stay and make the world a little less cold. If this story touched you, perhaps it's because somewhere inside you too once believed you were not enough, not strong enough, not good enough, not worthy of being chosen. But sometimes what the world needs most is not loud strength, but someone who dares to stay when things become difficult. Thank you for reaching the end with Deep Life Tales. If you saw yourself in this story, leave a comment. We are listening. Like and share if you believe this story could reach someone else. And subscribe to continue walking with stories about ordinary people learning how to be brave. See you in the following story.